The first punch never landed. That's the part people never believe. They expect me to say I froze, or screamed, or took it the way every pamphlet says a woman should. Instead, 3 days after I said I do, my husband swung at my face over our wedding money and snapped, "Don't make this a thing." I caught his wrist and put him on the floor. What I didn't know yet, I wasn't the first woman he'd said that to. His fist never touched me. That's the part nobody believes when I tell them. 3 days after the wedding, 3 days after the champagne and the vows and the white dress my mother spent 4 months choosing, my husband swung at my face in our new kitchen, and I put him on the floor so hard his rib cracked against the cabinet edge. The price tags were still on the cabinets. The tile was still cold under my bare feet. And the man I had married 72 hours earlier was lying in cereal milk and blood, staring up at me like I was the one who had done something unforgivable. My name is Cressida Ballard. I was 29 years old. I was a program coordinator at a nonprofit in Wilmington, Delaware. And until that Tuesday evening in July 2025, I believed I had married a good man. Landon Prescott was 35, a certified financial planner whose clients at Cornerstone Wealth Advisors trusted him with their retirement accounts, their children's college funds, their futures. He was 6'1", articulate, and handsome in the way that makes older women at dinner parties say things like, "You did well." He was also standing at the counter eating cereal in the gray t-shirt he'd slept in when he noticed the credit card statement on the island. People expect me to say I froze. They expect the version where the woman curls up on the kitchen floor and takes it. That is not what happened, and I will not pretend it is. "You spent $3,000 without asking me?" He set his spoon down too hard. It cracked against the countertop like a starter pistol. "That's our money, Cressida." The $3,000 was wedding gift money, cash from envelopes, checks from relatives. I had used it to buy the kitchen equipment we'd talked about for months, the stand mixer, the knife set, the Dutch oven he'd pointed out in a catalog and said someday. Someday had arrived. I made the decision. I didn't know decisions required his signature. "Our money that we agreed to decide on together," I said. "You don't get to." He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps, not walking, closing distance. His face went flat, like someone had pulled a shade down behind his eyes, and he said 5 words I would hear again from another woman's mouth 6 months later in a courtroom. "Don't turn this into a thing." Then he swung. I didn't decide to fight back. That's what I keep turning over. Even now, there was no decision, no thought, no brave moment where I chose to stand my ground. My body simply did what my father had spent 22 years putting into it. I caught Landon's wrist with my left hand, turned my hip into his center of gravity, and redirected his momentum the way you redirect a door that's swinging too fast. Physics, leverage, muscle memory from a backyard in Dover where a retired corrections sergeant taught his daughter how to move. Landon went down. His right side hit the cabinet edge, and I heard a sound I will never be able to unhear, a wet crack, like a branch breaking under ice. He made a noise that was somewhere between a gasp and a grunt, and then he was on the tile, holding his ribs, breathing in short pulls, staring up at me with an expression that wasn't pain and wasn't anger. It was calculation. I called 911 with my hands shaking, not from fear, from adrenaline, the kind that floods your system so fast your fingers feel like they belong to someone else. The fluorescent kitchen light was buzzing. The new paint smell of the apartment mixed with something sharper, something metallic in my mouth that I later learned was my own body preparing for a fight that was already over. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. They put Landon on a stretcher and took him to Christiana Care Wilmington Hospital with a fractured rib. He didn't speak to me, not a word, not I'm sorry or what happened, or even help. He just watched me from the stretcher with that same calculating expression, like a man running numbers in his head, already figuring out how to make the math work in his favor. I stood in the kitchen doorway and watched the ambulance pull away. Then I picked up my phone and called the only person in the world I trusted to hear what I was about to say. Vernon Ballard, my father, 60 years old, retired corrections sergeant, 24 years at the Kent County facility in Dover, picked up on the second ring. He picked up the way a man picks up a phone when he has rehearsed this exact call in his head for 2 decades. "Are you safe?" he said. Not what happened, not are you hurt, not where's Landon. Are you safe? I put him on the floor, Dad. My voice cracked for the first time. I put my husband on the floor. There was a pause. Not the kind where someone is deciding what to say, the kind where someone is deciding how steady to make their voice before they say it. "I'm driving up now," Vernon said. "Don't talk to anyone else until I get there." I hung up and sat on the kitchen floor, my back against the cabinet that had cracked my husband's rib, and I cried for the first time that night. Not because I was afraid, not because I was hurt, because my father had asked, "Are you safe?" on the second ring, and that meant he had always known this call was coming. He had known before I did, and whatever he had been training me for since I was 7 years old, it wasn't self-defense. It was something else entirely. The first time my father put my hand on a man's wrist, I was 7 years old, and the man was him. Summer of 2003. The backyard in Dover smelled like cut grass and coconut sunscreen. Vernon knelt on the lawn in his old work shorts, took my small fingers and placed them on the inside of his wrist, right where the tendons meet the pulse. "Right here," he said. "You feel that? That's where someone stops being in control." I remember laughing. I remember thinking it was a game. He never called it self-defense. He called it just in case, the way you'd call a flashlight in the glove box, just in case. He taught me how to fall without breaking anything, how to get out from underneath someone bigger, how to turn my hip into a strike using someone else's weight. Every Saturday morning for years, while my mother made breakfast and my brother Danny watched cartoons, Vernon and I ran drills in the backyard like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. One morning, I asked him why Danny didn't get these lessons. Vernon looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Your brother's a boy walking through the world. You're a girl walking through it. Different world, same feet." I didn't understand what he meant until I was 29, standing in a kitchen with my husband's rib giving way beneath my forearm. Same feet, different world entirely. The memory dissolved under fluorescent light. I was sitting in a plastic chair in the hallway of ChristianaCare Wilmington Hospital, the adrenaline still humming like a low current, and a woman with a badge on a lanyard was pulling a chair up next to mine. Sergeant Nola Garrett was 38, a domestic response specialist with the Wilmington Police Department who spoke the way certain people listen, slowly, with space around every word, like she understood that silence gathered more truth than questions ever could. She had a notepad, but barely used it. She watched my hands while I talked. I want to be honest about something. Sitting in that hallway, I almost told her it wasn't that bad. That reflex, the one worn smooth by years of hearing, "Don't make a scene," nearly won. I almost minimized the whole thing into a misunderstanding between newlyweds. I almost swallowed the story the way I'd been taught to swallow difficult things, quickly, without tasting them. But Sergeant Garrett didn't rush me. She let me sit with the silence until I found my own words. "Walk me through it again," she said, "from when you saw his face change." So I did, twice, the argument, the distance he closed, the 5 words, the swing, the reflex that put him on the tile. She wrote it down without reacting, without the expression I kept waiting for, the one that said, "You did something wrong." When I finished, she asked if I wanted my injuries photographed. "I'm not hurt," I said. "He's the one in there." "That's exactly why I need your statement to be thorough," she said. No judgment, just a woman who had sat in this hallway enough times to know that the person without the bruises sometimes needed the most protection. She checked my arms, my wrists, my shoulders. There was a red line on my forearm where I'd caught his swing, already fading. She photographed it anyway. She photographed the kitchen when she went back. She was building something I didn't recognize yet, a record, the kind that would matter later, in rooms I hadn't imagined entering. The ER was quiet, the way hospitals are quiet at night, not silent, but muffled, like the building was holding its breath. Monitors beeped behind curtains. Nurses moved in soft shoes. Somewhere down the hall, a child cried in short, exhausted bursts. The nurse who had brought me water 20 minutes earlier, a kind woman with reading glasses on her forehead, walked past the curtain where Landon was being treated. I watched her stop. I watched Landon lean toward her from the bed, one hand pressed to his bandaged ribs, his mouth moving in that low, careful tone I recognized, the voice he used with clients, the voice he used when he wanted someone to trust him before they had any reason to. That nurse had been kind to me 10 minutes ago. She had touched my shoulder and said, "Can I get you anything, sweetheart?" Now she glanced at me through the gap in the curtain, and her face had changed. Not concern, not sympathy, suspicion, the kind of look you give someone you've just been warned about. Whatever Landon told her in those 30 seconds, whatever quiet, reasonable story he constructed from that hospital bed with a fractured rib and a voice like warm honey, it was already working. I could see it in the way she walked past me, a little farther away, a little more guarded. I was rewriting the story before I had even finished telling mine. I sat in that plastic chair and looked down at my hands, the hands Vernon had trained on his own wrists in a Dover backyard 22 years ago. And I understood something that made the fluorescent light feel 10 degrees colder. The fight in the kitchen had lasted 8 seconds. The fight for what actually happened was just beginning. The doctor didn't believe him. I could see it in the way he tilted his reading glasses down and looked at Landon's forearm a second time, turning it under the overhead light, like a man reading fine print he already knew was forged. Dr. Colvin was the ER attending that night, mid-50s, calm in the way all emergency physicians are calm, with the practiced patience of someone who had heard too many staircase stories to believe another one. He pressed 2 fingers along the bruise line on Landon's forearm and said, quietly, almost gently, "The bruising on your forearm is a grip pattern, Mr. Prescott. That doesn't happen from falling on stairs." What happened next took less than 3 seconds, but I will carry those 3 seconds for the rest of my life. Landon's face didn't crumble. It recalibrated. The stumbling husband act, the wincing, the sheepish half-smile, the eye tripped coming down from the bedroom, vanished like a projection switched off. In its place was something precise, something I had never seen in the man I married, but recognized instantly from the man I was beginning to understand he had always been. "Because I didn't fall," he said. His voice was steady, measured, the same tone he used when explaining portfolio returns to nervous retirees. My wife attacked me, without provocation. I was standing in my own kitchen, and she came at me. He looked directly at me through the gap in the curtain as he said it. "I need you to understand something." He didn't stumble into that lie. He walked into it the way a man walks into a conference room, prepared, positioned, already knowing the exit. The first story, the staircase, had been a placeholder, a draft, When the doctor rejected it, Landon didn't panic. He simply moved to the version he'd been saving, the real version, the one designed not for a doctor, but for a file. Without provocation, he repeated, and I watched the doctor write it down. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, and no sound came out. My throat closed around the words like a fist, not because I was afraid of him, because I was afraid of what I had just watched happen. A man I had loved 48 hours ago had looked me in the eye and lied about me to a medical professional with the fluency of someone signing a document he'd already reviewed. The nurse updated the chart. She didn't look at me. She didn't ask for my side. She wrote what Landon said in the same neat handwriting she'd used to note his vitals, and the story became part of a record that would follow me into rooms I hadn't yet imagined entering. Have you ever watched someone you loved become someone you didn't recognize? Not slowly, not over years, but in a single sentence. That's what it felt like. One sentence, and the man I married was gone. In his place was someone who used words like tools, placing each one exactly where it would do the most structural damage. I sat in the hallway and replayed his exact phrasing. Without provocation, defending myself, she came at me. Those aren't words you use when you're frightened. Those aren't words that come from shock or confusion or the adrenaline of being put on a kitchen floor by a woman half your size. Those are words you use when you're filing something, when you're building something, when you've already spoken to someone who told you exactly what to say and in what order. The antiseptic smell of the hallway was making me nauseous. I pressed my nails into my palms hard enough to leave half-moon marks and swallowed the bile that kept climbing up the back of my throat. Stale coffee from the nurse's station drifted past. The heart monitor behind the curtain beeped in steady rhythm, calm and mechanical, completely indifferent to the lie being constructed 3 feet from its sensors. 3 days. I had been married for 3 days, and I was sitting in an emergency room hallway trying to figure out whether my husband was going to have me arrested. Sergeant Garrett's report was thorough. I knew that. She had photographed everything. She had walked me through my statement twice. She had built a record with the careful attention of someone who understood that records were the only thing standing between a woman's truth and the version a man with a nice voice could sell to a room full of strangers. But Landon had his own record now, his own words in a medical chart written by a nurse who never asked me what happened, his own version of that kitchen, sealed inside a file that would sit in a system designed to treat the first story as the default and everything after it as contradiction. He swung first. I knew it. Garrett's report would confirm it. But sitting in that hallway, watching the doctor nod while Landon spoke, watching the chart update without anyone once turning to me, I understood something that would take weeks to fully land. In a system built on paperwork, the person who tells the first story writes the first draft. And Landon had always been very, very good with paperwork. Vernon arrived at 2 a.m. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't ask about Landon. He walked into that ER hallway, looked at my face, and said, "We're going home." By sunrise, I was in my childhood bedroom in Dover, staring at the ceiling, waiting for my mother to wake up and say the words I already knew were coming. My mother said, "You just got married," 4 times in 90 seconds, like the calendar itself was the tragedy. Lorraine Ballard was 58 years old, a woman who had spent 30 years supervising the cafeteria at Dover's Central School District, and she stood at the kitchen counter gripping a dish towel like it was the only thing keeping her upright. She didn't ask if I was hurt. She didn't ask what happened. She asked what people would say. "You just got married," she said again. Can't this be worked out? People will talk." I had been sitting at that kitchen table since sunrise, wearing yesterday's clothes, drinking coffee I couldn't taste, and waiting for exactly this. The words I'd been dreading since Vernon drove me home from the hospital at 2 a.m. Not anger, not outrage on my behalf, shame. The quiet, reflexive shame of a woman who had spent her entire adult life making sure the surface of things looked right, even when everything underneath was cracking. He swung at me, Mom. I know, she said. And the way she said it, soft, almost apologetic, like the fact itself was an inconvenience, told me everything I needed to know about where she stood. I want to be honest about something. A part of me almost agreed with her. That old instinct to smooth it over, to not be the woman who blows up a marriage 4 days in. It was still alive in me, sitting right next to the bruise on my forearm that had already faded to a faint yellow. The instinct to minimize, to perform stability, to make everyone else comfortable at the cost of my own truth. I felt it pull at me the way a current pulls at your ankles, and I understood for the first time how many women had drowned in exactly that feeling. Vernon hadn't said a word. He sat at the far end of the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around his own mug, listening the way he always listened, completely, without interruption, storing every detail the way he'd stored intake reports for 24 years behind the glass at Kent County. When Lorraine finished cycling through her fears about relatives and church friends and what the neighbors on Maple Lane would think, Vernon looked at me and asked one question. Did you keep the photos? Yes, I said. Sergeant Garrett made sure of it. He nodded once. Then he left the room. Vernon came back, carrying a logbook, the way another father might carry a photo album, something kept not for sentiment, but for evidence, because in his world, evidence was how you kept people safe. The leather cover was cracked along the spine. The pages were lined, filled with his small, precise handwriting, corrections officer penmanship, every letter accountable. He set it on the table between us, but didn't open it. Not yet. I need to show you something, he said. But first, I need to tell you something I should have said louder 8 months ago. The kitchen went quiet. Lorraine stopped wringing the dish towel. The coffee maker clicked off, and I was suddenly back in this same kitchen on a different night, watching my father dry Thanksgiving dishes while the man I loved sat in the living room laughing with my brother. November 2024. Landon had come to Dover for the first time. He wore a blazer to a turkey dinner, brought a bottle of wine that cost more than my mother's entire grocery list, and charmed the table with stories about his clients and their retirement portfolios. Everyone laughed. Everyone was impressed. Everyone except Vernon, who shook Landon's hand too long at the door and watched him through dinner the way he watched new arrivals through the intake window, measuring, cataloging, filing. Later, while I helped him dry dishes, Vernon said it quietly enough that Lorraine couldn't hear from the living room. He talks about money like it belongs to him, not to both of you, and that ex-wife he calls unstable. He never says what she actually did. Dad, you're being overprotective, I said. I'm not a kid anymore. Standing in that kitchen 8 months earlier, I had rolled my eyes at my father. Now I was sitting in the same kitchen, wishing I could reach back through time and grab my own shoulder. I've seen this type before, Cress, he had said that night, setting a plate in the drying rack with the careful precision of a man placing evidence into a locker. I've watched them through the glass for 24 years. I had walked away from that conversation. I had married the man my father warned me about, and now I was sitting at the same table, in the same chair, with a fractured marriage where a fractured rib had been, and my father was pulling out the logbook he had kept for 3 decades because he understood something I was only beginning to learn. Vernon set the logbook on the table, but didn't open it. He looked at me the way he used to look at me across the backyard before a new drill, patient, measuring whether I was ready. Patterns. My father knew better than anyone. Leave paperwork. And the logbook sitting between us on that kitchen table was 30 years of a man whose entire career had been built on recognizing what people were before they showed you. He had tried to tell me at Thanksgiving. I hadn't listened, but Vernon Ballard was not a man who stopped keeping records just because his daughter wasn't ready to read them. Vernon didn't open the logbook that morning. He set it on the table between us like a promise he wasn't ready to explain and said, "Not yet. First, I want you to remember something." So I remembered. If you watch the wedding video, and I still have it, I haven't deleted it, you'd never guess what he'd do 3 days later. June 2025. Bellevue State Park, the pavilion overlooking the creek. 60 guests, string lights strung between the oak posts, the smell of honeysuckle thick enough to taste. Vernon wore a suit he hadn't touched since his retirement dinner and stood in the front row with his jaw tight, holding it together the way men of his generation hold everything together, silently, with effort, hoping nobody notices. Landon cried during his vows, real tears, or what I believed were real tears. He cupped my face in both hands and said, "I can't believe I get to keep you." And every woman in the pavilion reached for a tissue. My mother squeezed Vernon's arm. My brother whistled from the third row. It was perfect. It was everything I had wanted since I was old enough to want it. During the photo session afterward, his phone buzzed. Then again, then a third time. I watched him pull it from his jacket pocket, glance at the screen, and power it off in one motion, smooth, practiced, the way you silence something you've been silencing for a while. "Who keeps calling?" I asked. "Work thing," he said, and his smile didn't falter. "Not today. Today is ours." You'd never guess, looking at that video. That's the thing about people like Landon. They don't slip up at weddings. They slip up in kitchens, behind closed doors, 3 days later, over a piece of equipment that costs less than the wine they served at the reception. The performance is flawless until the audience goes home. I believed him about the phone. I wanted to believe him. Those are two different things, and I didn't know that yet. Back in Dover, day 5, the wedding video sat in my camera roll like a crime scene photo I couldn't bring myself to delete. I sat on the edge of my childhood bed, in a room still decorated with swim team ribbons and a corkboard of college acceptance letters, and I made the decision to stop being a wife and start being a witness. I sent the injury photos, the screenshots, Sergeant Garrett's card, every text message from Landon since the kitchen, 3 of them, all casual, all worded as if nothing had happened. "Hey, we should talk. I think we both overreacted. Call me when you're ready." Each one crafted to sound reasonable if read aloud in front of a judge. Vernon watched me assemble the file from the doorway. When I finished, he handed me a business card. "Her name is Kezia Farrell," he said. "She handled a case for a man I worked with at Kent County. She doesn't lose." How do you explain to a lawyer that the man who cried during his vows swung at your face 72 hours later? And that somehow you're the one who needs to prove you didn't start it? I didn't know, but I called anyway. Kezia Farrell was 42, a family law attorney whose Wilmington office walls held more restraining orders than diplomas. She picked up the phone at 9 in the evening and listened without interrupting for 6 minutes straight. No gasps, no sympathetic murmurs, just silence and the faint scratch of a pen on paper, the sound of someone building a structure out of facts. When I finished, she asked 3 questions. Were the photos time-stamped? Did the police report include Landon's original staircase story? Had I signed anything since leaving the apartment?
Yes, yes, no.
Good, she said. Send me everything tonight. All of it. The photos, the texts, the officer's card. I want the ER records too, if you can get them. He told the doctor I attacked him, I said. Without provocation. Those were his exact words. There was a pause. Not the uncertain kind. The kind where someone is choosing between the careful answer and the real one. That language tells me he's already talked to someone, Kezia said, which means we're not ahead, but we're not behind either. Not yet. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that changed the shape of everything that came after. Cressida, if you can find someone who was in your position before you, your file gets a lot stronger. I sat on my childhood bed and let that sentence settle. Find someone who was in your position before you. She said it like a suggestion, but it landed like an assignment, like a door I hadn't known existed, opening onto a hallway I couldn't see the end of. And, sitting there in the dark, with my phone in my hand and the wedding video still glowing in my camera roll, I thought about the one detail I hadn't been able to explain away. The unknown number that kept calling during our photos. The screen, Landon killed, with one thumb press and a smile that never wavered. Someone had been trying to reach him on his wedding day. Someone who already knew what I was only beginning to learn. I didn't have a name yet. But I had Kezia's question. And questions, my father had taught me, were just paperwork that hadn't been filed yet. I never found the unknown caller. But 3 days after Kezia told me to find someone who came before me, I walked into her office expecting to file paperwork, and instead she handed me a restraining order with my name on it as the defendant. The document was sitting on her desk when I arrived. She didn't soften it. She didn't build up to it. She slid it across the leather blotter and let me read it myself, because Kezia Farrell understood that some things need to be absorbed in silence. Landon had filed for a temporary protective order 2 days earlier. The language was clean, professional, familiar, without provocation, feared for his safety. Respondent exhibited violent and erratic behavior. The same phrases I'd heard him rehearse from a hospital bed, now typed in 12-point font on a court filing with my full legal name printed underneath the word respondent. He swung first. I caught his wrist. He went to the ER. And somehow, 8 days later, I was the one sitting across from my lawyer, reading my own name on a restraining order. He filed this 2 days ago, Kezia said. You're the respondent, not the petitioner. He swung first, I said. I have a police report. He has an ER record that says fractured rib and a sworn statement that says unprovoked. Kezia's voice was level, but her eyes were not. If the judge believes his version, you don't just lose the apartment, you lose everything, including the ability to tell your side without a criminal record attached to it. The office smelled like printer toner, and the leather of the chairs that were too expensive for how uncomfortable they were. I sat in one of them and felt the document in my hands, the weight of it, the texture of the paper, the absurdity of holding a legal filing that described me as a danger to a man who had tried to hit me in my own kitchen. Reading that document was like watching someone translate the worst night of my life into a language designed to make me the villain. Same facts, same kitchen, same fractured rib. Completely different story. Every detail had been rearranged with surgical precision. The cereal bowl became a quiet evening at home. The argument about money became a sudden, unprovoked escalation. My catching his wrist became a violent assault resulting in serious bodily harm. It was my life, rewritten by a man who understood that whoever files first gets to set the terms. Kezia walked me through the hearing timeline. We had 21 days before a judge would decide whether to make the temporary order permanent. 21 days to build a case that proved a pattern, not just an incident. "The police report helps," she said. "Sergeant Garrett's documentation is solid, but a judge looking at this sees a man with a broken rib and a woman with no visible injuries. That's the gap we have to close." "How?" "Evidence of pattern, prior behavior, someone who can testify that this isn't the first time he's done this." There it was again, the same instruction, circling back. "Find someone who was there before you." I left Kezia's office and sat in my car in the parking lot. July heat pressed against the windshield, turning the interior into something close to an oven. I gripped the steering wheel with both hands and let the hot vinyl burn my palms, because at least that was a sensation I could control. I want you to sit with that for a second. The man who threw the first punch was now the man the court was protecting, and I was the one who had to prove otherwise, prove a negative, prove that the absence of bruises didn't mean the absence of violence, prove that the woman without the fractured rib was the one who needed protection. I called Vernon. "Dad, he filed a restraining order," I said, "against me. He's saying I attacked him." There was silence on the line. Not the helpless kind, the Vernon kind, the silence of a man who had spent decades sitting across from people who lied with fluency and confidence, and who had learned that the best response to a well-constructed lie was a better constructed truth. "Does Kezia have a plan?" he asked. "She says we need someone who's been through this before, someone who can prove this is a pattern, not an incident." "Then find them," Vernon said, simply, like it was the next drill in a sequence he'd already mapped out. I hung up and sat in the baking car with the restraining order on my lap. The paper was already starting to curl from the heat. I thought about Kezia's instruction and Vernon's single command and the phone that buzzed during my wedding photos. I thought about the word Landon used whenever his ex-wife came up in conversation, unstable, always without specifics, always with that measured tone that made the listener nod instead of ask follow-up questions. I opened my phone. I typed his full name into the search bar, then added one word I had never thought to search alongside it until this moment: divorce. The results loaded in 2 seconds. A public court record from Newcastle County, 2019, a dissolution filing, and a name I had never heard Landon say out loud, not once, not in 8 months of dating, not during the engagement, not at the wedding. There she was, the woman he'd erased so thoroughly I didn't know she existed, and I was going to find her. Her name was Tamara Hewitt, 39 years old, independent bookkeeper, based somewhere in the Wilmington area, married to Landon Prescott from 2013 to 2019, divorced quietly, no children, no public record beyond the dissolution filing itself. A woman reduced to a single line in a county database, and I had never heard Landon say her name, not once. I went back to the apartment the next morning for my clothes. I left with proof that my husband had been lying long before he ever met me. The place was empty. Landon was staying somewhere else, a colleague's guest room maybe, or a hotel. The restraining order he'd filed kept him from the apartment while the hearing was pending, which meant the court had given me temporary access to collect essentials. I came for jeans and work blouses. I stayed because the guest room drawer was open, the drawer where we'd stored wedding cards and gift envelopes, the drawer where I'd assumed there was nothing but thank you lists and receipts. But underneath the cards, stacked neatly and held together with a binder clip, were credit card statements, 4 of them, all in Landon's name, all showing balances I had never seen. How does a man who advises clients on financial transparency hide $22,000 in debt from the woman he's about to marry? He does it the same way he hides everything else, by trusting that no one will look, by banking on the assumption that love makes people incurious, by keeping the drawer closed and the smile open. The debt was dated 14 months before our wedding. He knew when we sat in premarital counseling and agreed that big financial decisions would be joint decisions. He knew when he shook the counselor's hand afterward. He knew when he stood under string lights at Bellevue and cried during his vows. $22,000 of knowing, tucked in a drawer underneath congratulations cards from my own relatives. I photographed every page, front and back, timestamps on each image. Kezia had taught me that much already. Photograph everything, timestamp everything, assume everything will be needed later. Then I found the photograph. It was small, 3 by 5, tucked beneath the last statement like an afterthought, someone couldn't quite throw away. The man in it was unmistakably Landon, younger, thinner, standing beside a woman I had never seen, in a venue I didn't recognize, wearing a ring I had never been told about. The woman was dark-haired, mid-30s in the photo, smiling the way people smile when they still believe the person standing next to them. On the back, in handwriting that wasn't Landon's, someone had written a name and a date. The name matched the court record I'd found the night before, Tamara Hewitt, June 2013. I sat on the edge of the bed I had shared with Landon for exactly 3 nights and held a photograph of a woman who had shared that bed, or one like it, for 6 years. The apartment was silent, except for the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, still running, still keeping his leftovers cold, as if he might come back any minute. His cologne lingered on a jacket draped over the bedroom chair. The air tasted like dust and closed windows and the stale remnant of a life that had been abandoned mid-sentence. I found Tamara on social media within minutes. Her profile was mostly private, but there was enough: a bookkeeping business page, a location in the Wilmington area, a profile photo of a woman who looked like someone who had rebuilt herself carefully and didn't want to be found. I typed the message slowly, every word deliberate, every sentence designed to sound like what it was: a stranger reaching out with shaking hands and a question she wasn't sure she wanted answered. I'm sorry to reach out like this. I recently married Landon Prescott. I found your name in some documents. I think we may need to talk. I sent it. The delivery confirmation appeared immediately. Then 4 seconds later, the status changed. Seen. I stared at that notification for 11 minutes. I know, because I counted. 11 minutes of watching a screen, waiting for a typing indicator that never appeared, while a woman I had never met sat somewhere in this same city, deciding whether the worst chapter of her life was worth reopening for a stranger. No typing bubbles, no reply, just 2 blue check marks and a silence that filled the apartment like smoke. She had seen it instantly, 4 seconds, which meant she was near her phone, which meant she hadn't put it down or scrolled past. She had read my message, recognized the name, and stopped. And in that stopping, in that 11-minute silence, I heard something louder than any reply could have been. She knew. She knew exactly why I was writing, and she was afraid. I drove back to Dover with the credit card statements in my bag, the wedding photo saved in my phone, and a message hanging in digital space like a hand extended to someone who hadn't decided yet whether to take it. The photo sat on my passenger seat the whole drive. Landon's younger face smiled up at me from a wedding that happened 6 years before ours. Same posture, same tilt of the head, same expression of a man who had perfected the performance of devotion. The woman beside him had no idea what was coming, neither had I. But Tamara Hewitt had survived it, and somewhere in Wilmington she was staring at her phone, deciding whether to help me survive it too. 2 days passed, Tamara's silence held, and the fight I wasn't prepared for didn't come from Landon or his lawyers or the court system. It came from my mother, standing at the kitchen sink in Dover with a dish towel in her hands and shame in her voice. Day 10. I was sitting at the kitchen table with Kezia's case notes spread out beside a cold cup of coffee when Lorraine turned off the faucet and said it without turning around. Aunt Faye called again. I didn't respond. She wants to know what happened. Pastor Whitfield's wife asked me at the market yesterday. Mrs. Delacroix from down the street saw the police report online. Apparently, those things are searchable now. She turned around. Her eyes were red, but her jaw was set. What am I supposed to tell people, Cressida? That you broke your husband's rib a week after the wedding? Tell them he swung first. That's not what I... Tell them the truth, Mom, or tell them nothing, but don't ask me to go back. Her face crumpled in a way I'd only seen once before, when her own mother died, and she'd held it together through the entire funeral until someone handed her a casserole dish in the parking lot, and something about the ordinary kindness of it broke her open. This was different. This wasn't grief. This was the collision between the daughter she thought she'd raised and the situation she had no script for. I'm not asking you to go back, she said, but her voice said otherwise. I'm asking you to think about what this does to the family, to your brother, to your father's name in this town. People talk, and once they start, let them talk. That's easy for you to say. You're not the one standing in the grocery store. I want to tell you, I handled it perfectly, that I was calm and measured and said exactly the right things. I didn't. I raised my voice at my mother for the first time since I was 16, and my hands were shaking the entire time. He tried to hit me, I said, and my voice cracked on the word hit, because saying it out loud in my mother's kitchen made it real in a way that police reports and lawyer meetings hadn't. He swung at my face in our kitchen 3 days after our wedding. And you're worried about what Aunt Faye thinks? I'm worried about you, she said. But the dish towel was twisted so tight in her hands that her knuckles were white. And I understood that what she was really worried about was the version of our family that existed in other people's minds. The clean version, the intact version, the version where her daughter married a financial planner and everything turned out fine. When did protecting your daughter become less important than protecting your reputation? When did what will people think start outweighing, are you safe? I wanted to ask her that. I wanted to scream it across the kitchen the way I'd never screamed at her about anything, because the woman who packed my lunches for 12 years and drove me to swim practice and sat in the front row at every recital was now standing 5 feet away, asking me to consider the feelings of Aunt Faye over the bruise on my forearm. But I didn't scream, because Vernon was in the doorway. My father didn't raise his voice. He never did when it mattered. But the way he filled that doorframe, 60 years old, hands at his sides, shoulders squared the way they'd been squared for 24 years behind the intake desk at Kent County, said everything a shout never could. He looked at Lorraine with an expression that was not anger and was not disappointment. It was patience. The kind of patience that comes from loving someone for 35 years and knowing exactly when they're wrong. Let your daughter decide, Lorraine, he said, quiet, final, like closing a logbook after the last entry. She's earned that. The kitchen went still. The faucet dripped twice into the silence. Lorraine looked at Vernon, then at me, then at the dish towel in her hands, as if she'd just realized she'd been strangling it. She set it down on the counter, smoothed it flat with both palms, and left the room without another word. Vernon stayed in the doorway for a moment. The pot roast smell from whatever Lorraine had started earlier hung in the air between us, the smell of a home that used to feel simple and now felt like a place where alliances were being drawn in real time. Then he looked at me and said something I didn't expect. Check your phone. I reached into my back pocket. The screen was lit. a notification I'd missed during the argument, a message from a name I'd been staring at for 2 days, waiting, counting hours, convincing myself she would never answer. Tamara Hewitt. 3 sentences. I read them standing in my mother's kitchen, with my father watching from the doorway and my mother's footsteps fading down the hall. I'm sorry it took me this long to answer. I needed to be sure you were real and not something he sent to test me. I was his wife too. I wrote back to Tamara that night. When and where? I'll be there. And she replied within the hour. A cafe in Greenville the following afternoon. But first, I had to survive the mediation. Landon sat across the table from me in a pressed blue shirt, and he lied the way other people breathe, effortlessly, completely, without a single tell. Day 12. Mandatory pre-hearing mediation at Kezia's office. Landon arrived with his attorney, a man in a gray suit who smelled like aftershave and billable hours. They sat on the far side of the conference table like 2 people who had rehearsed the seating arrangement. The mediator, a court-appointed woman with a legal pad and a neutral expression that never changed, opened with the standard language about good faith resolution. Landon nodded along like a man at a church service, attentive, respectful, concerned. Then he spoke. I loved my wife, he said, present tense carefully shifted to past. I still do, but she has a pattern of escalating small disagreements into physical confrontations. Ask anyone who knows her. I gripped the edge of the table underneath, where no one could see. My knuckles turned white against the wood. Kezia's hand found my forearm and pressed once. Stay still, stay quiet, let him talk. So I let him talk. And what came out of his mouth was a version of me I had never met. A woman with a temper. A woman who overreacted to small things. A woman whose friends, unnamed, unspecified, conveniently vague, could apparently testify to a history of volatility that existed nowhere except inside Landon's narrative. I sat across from the man I had married 12 days earlier and watched him describe a version of me that didn't exist. And the worst part wasn't the lie. It was how natural it looked coming out of his mouth. The slight pause before physical confrontations, as if the words pained him. The way he looked down at his hands when he said, I still do. Every gesture calibrated for the mediator's notepad. He wasn't defending himself. He was auditioning, and he was terrifyingly good at it. The mediation lasted 40 minutes. Nothing was resolved. Landon's attorney declined every proposal Kezia put forward: mutual withdrawal of the protective orders, structured communication, temporary financial separation. Every no was delivered with the same polished regret, the same implication that they wished things could be different, but their client's safety had to come first. His safety. The man who swung at me in our kitchen was sitting across a conference table talking about his safety. Walking out of that mediation felt like leaving a room where the verdict had already been written in pencil, not permanent yet, but close enough to see the shape of it. Kezia walked me to the elevator and said something quietly enough that only I could hear. He's rehearsed this, every word, every pause. That means he's scared of something we haven't found yet. Scared of what? Scared that whatever happened with his first wife will surface. People don't build performances this polished unless they've had to before. I sat in my car in the parking lot with the engine off and the July heat pressing through the windshield. The seatbelt was still buckled. I hadn't remembered to take it off. My hands were on my lap and my eyes were on the dashboard, and I was trying to figure out how to fight a man who could sit across a table and invent a woman who had never existed and make a room full of professionals nod along. Then my phone buzzed. I looked down. The screen showed a name I had been waiting 2 days to see again. Tamara Hewitt. Not the 3 sentences from before. This was longer. A full message. I read it with the air conditioning off and sweat forming on the back of my neck. I'm sorry it took me this long. I had to decide if I was ready to go back to that place. I was his wife, too, for 6 years. And what you described in your message, the money, the control, the way he rewrites what happened until you almost believe his version, I lived that. Every day, we need to talk, not over text, in person. I have things you need to see. I was his wife, too. 4 words that meant I wasn't crazy. I wasn't alone. And Landon Prescott had done this before. I sat in that hot car and read the message 3 times. Each time, the words hit differently. The first time, relief so sharp, it felt like a physical sensation, like stepping out of a building you didn't realize was on fire. The second time, anger, deep and structural, the kind that doesn't burn out because it's built on something solid. The third time, something quieter, recognition. 2 women, separated by 6 years, married to the same man, surviving the same playbook. I typed back, tomorrow, name the place. She replied in under a minute. A cafe in Greenville, 2 o'clock. And one more line that I would carry with me into that meeting and every meeting after it. Bring your documents. I'll bring mine. He used the same accounts. I'm sure of it. For the first time since the kitchen floor, I felt the ground shift in my direction. Not much, not enough, but enough to stand on. She was already sitting at the corner table when I walked in, a woman I'd never met who knew my husband better than I did. Brew, ha ha, cafe in Greenville, 2 o'clock on a Wednesday. Tamara Hewitt was 39, an independent bookkeeper with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a quiet steadiness that came from having rebuilt a life she once thought was over. Landon's first wife, the woman he called unstable at Thanksgiving dinner without ever saying her name. She was sitting with a cardboard box beside her chair and both hands wrapped around a cup of tea she hadn't touched. I sat down across from her. Neither of us spoke for a moment. The espresso machine hissed behind the counter. A barista called someone's name. The cafe hummed with the ordinary noise of a Tuesday afternoon, and 2 women who had married the same man looked at each other across a table and tried to figure out where to begin. Tamara started. He made me ask permission to buy shampoo, she said. Her voice was low, steady, almost clinical. The voice of someone who had practiced saying these things out loud until the shaking stopped. Not because we were broke, because he needed to know where every dollar went, control disguised as responsibility. I felt something shift in my chest. Not surprise, recognition, the same language, the same system, the same quiet suffocation dressed up as financial planning. He said you were unstable, I told her. That's the word he used at Thanksgiving, unstable. Tamara let out a quiet laugh that had no humor in it. Of course he did. That's what he calls anyone who stops obeying. 2 women who had married the same man, sitting in a cafe in Greenville, finishing each other's sentences about a playbook neither of us had known existed until that afternoon. She described the joint account she couldn't access, the permission slips for grocery runs, the way he monitored her phone for purchase notifications. She described the argument about a charge he made without telling her, new suits for work, nearly $1,000, and how when she confronted him about the hypocrisy, he shoved her into a doorframe and told her she was imagining things. I left that night, Tamara said. I drove to my sister's house in Philadelphia, and I didn't go back. I filed for divorce 3 weeks later. I never reported the shove. I never told anyone except my sister and my therapist. I spent 6 years trying to forget his name. Why didn't you report it? She looked at me with an expression I recognized because I'd seen it in my own mirror. Because he told me no one would believe me. and I believed him. I want you to picture this. A cardboard box on a cafe table, that long a stretch of bank statements inside, kept by a woman who couldn't explain to herself why she never threw them away, until a stranger's message gave her the reason. Tamara reached down and lifted the box onto the table. The cardboard was soft at the corners, the kind that comes from being moved between closets and storage units, carried from one apartment to the next by someone who couldn't let go of proof she didn't yet know she'd need. I kept these for 6 years, she said. I didn't know why until your message. She opened the lid. Inside were bank statements, account summaries, a copy of her dissolution filing, and a stack of emails she'd printed and dated in the margins with a bookkeeper's precision. I pulled out the first statement and looked at the account number in the top right corner. My hands went still. The account numbers matched. The same accounts Landon used to hide money from Tamara were the same ones still generating the debt I'd found in our guest room drawer. 2 marriages apart, 2 wives, 1 system. He hadn't even changed the routing numbers. He hadn't needed to, because he never expected anyone to compare notes. Some of these account numbers, I said, and my voice sounded far away from my own body. I've seen them, in documents I found in our apartment last week. Tamara's hands went flat on the box lid. She pressed down like she was holding something in place. Years of silence, years of being called unstable, years of wondering if she'd overreacted. She wasn't holding the box. She was holding herself steady. Then it's the same, she said. Everything. He didn't change anything. No, I said. He didn't. We sat with that for a moment. The cafe noise filled the space around us. Cups clinking, the milk steamer, someone laughing at the counter, and it all sounded impossibly normal for what was happening at our table. 2 women, 2 marriages, 1 man, and a box of proof that connected them across all that time like a thread pulled tight enough to cut. I stepped outside and called Kezia. She picked up on the first ring. The accounts match, I said. Same numbers, same structure. She has 6 years of records. Kezia's voice was different this time. Not cautious, not reassuring, sharp with something that sounded like momentum. Send me everything tonight, she said. We have 8 days. And if this woman is willing to testify, his restraining order isn't just going to be denied. It's going to be the worst decision he ever made. I looked back through the cafe window. Tamara was still at the table, both hands flat on the box, staring at the documents like she was seeing them clearly for the first time. 6 years of carrying proof she thought would never matter. 8 days until it would matter more than anything. Kezia spread Tamara's records across her desk the next morning like a crime scene reconstruction, and within 20 minutes, she found the thread that connected everything. Day 14. Tamara sat beside me in Kezia's office while our lawyer worked in silence, lining up bank statements from 2 marriages side by side, circling account numbers with a red pen, building a timeline on a legal pad that grew longer with every page she turned. The office smelled like ink toner and legal paper. The evidence folder on the corner of her desk had tripled in thickness since I'd first walked through her door 6 days ago. Kezia stopped on a line halfway down a statement from 2017. She pulled a second document from the stack I'd brought from the apartment, one of the credit card statements with the hidden debt. She set them next to each other and tapped both with her pen. This account, she said, looking at Tamara, the one he opened during your marriage. It's still active. He never closed it. There are transactions from June of this year. Tamara leaned forward. Her reading glasses slid down her nose. She stared at the numbers and her jaw tightened. That's the account I wasn't supposed to know about, she said. He told me it was closed when we divorced. He swore to it. He lied then, Kezia said. He's lying now. And this is the kind of evidence judges remember. Watching Kezia work was like watching my father teach me a new drill, methodical, patient, every piece placed exactly where it needed to be before the final move. She built the timeline across both marriages with the precision of someone constructing a bridge. Tamara's account records on the left, mine on the right, the same structure mirrored across 6 years, same bank, same routing numbers, same pattern of small transfers designed to stay under reporting thresholds. Same language on the account applications, household emergency fund, a phrase that appeared on documents signed during Tamara's marriage and again on documents opened 3 months before mine, and hadn't even changed the description. The same 2 words, 6 years apart, because he never imagined anyone would put the pages next to each other. Tamara confirmed every piece, the joint account she couldn't access, the permission requests for basic purchases, the way Landon framed financial control as fiscal responsibility, wrapping it in the language of a certified financial planner until it sounded like common sense instead of coercion. She confirmed the argument about his unreported suits purchase. She confirmed the shove into the doorframe. And she confirmed that when she left, she kept every document, not because she planned to use them, but because a bookkeeper's instinct told her records should never be destroyed. Here's what I've learned about men like Landon. They're not afraid of anger or tears or confrontation. They're afraid of records. They're afraid of the paper trail they assumed no one would ever bother to follow. Landon built his entire life on the confidence that the women he controlled would be too ashamed, too exhausted, or too beaten down to compare notes. He never considered that one of them might be a bookkeeper who couldn't bring herself to throw away a bank statement. Kezia closed the last folder and looked at me across her desk. 7 days, she said. If Tamara testifies and these account records hold up, we don't just beat his restraining order. We expose a pattern that goes back years. 7 days. I let the number settle. 1 week to organize 6 years of evidence into something a judge could hold in her hands and weigh against the polished performance Landon would deliver from the other side of the courtroom. But what none of us knew, what I wouldn't learn until months later, was that while Kezia was building our case from one direction, someone inside Landon's own company was building one from another. I didn't know about this yet. None of us did. But the same week, Kezia was circling account numbers in red pen. A colleague at Cornerstone Wealth Advisors was reviewing quarterly reports and noticing something that didn't add up. Several client accounts managed by Landon showed unusual fee structures, small charges that appeared regularly, always just under the threshold that would trigger an automatic review. Unexplained transfers between client portfolios that left no paper trail except the one generated by the firm's own compliance software. She filed a quiet report with the compliance department. No phone call, no confrontation, just a form submitted through the internal system, flagged for review, routed to a department that Landon probably walked past every morning without ever glancing through the glass. 2 separate investigations into the same man, running in parallel, neither aware of the other. The courthouse case and the corporate case were about to collide, and Landon was standing at the intersection with his eyes closed. My father always said, liars don't get caught by someone smarter than them. They get caught by paperwork, by the receipt they forgot to destroy, by the account they were too arrogant to close, by the bookkeeper ex-wife who kept every statement in a cardboard box all that time, and the compliance analyst who noticed a decimal point in the wrong column on a Tuesday afternoon. Landon didn't know the walls were closing. He couldn't see Kezia's timeline or Tamara's box or the compliance report working its way through corporate channels. He was still out there somewhere, rehearsing his performance for the hearing, convinced he was the smartest person in every room. I was about to learn he wasn't even the smartest person in the building. While Kezia built the case and the compliance report worked its way through Cornerstone's corporate channels, Landon made his move. Not through his lawyer, not through the court, in person, in a parking lot, the way men like him always do when no one else is watching. I was halfway to my car after work on day 15 when I heard his voice behind me. Casual, almost friendly, like we'd bumped into each other at a grocery store. Cress. I was leaning against my driver's side door in a white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, suit jacket draped over one arm. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot asphalt, and his cologne hit me before his words did. The same cologne from our first date, the same one that used to make me lean closer. Now it made my stomach turn. "I've been thinking," he said. We both said things we didn't mean. I talked to someone, a counselor, and she said, "This is textbook stress response. New marriage, new pressures. We can still walk this back." His voice was warm, rehearsed, the same register he'd used during courtship, the same measured cadence he'd used at the mediation. He smiled the way he smiled in our wedding photos, open, vulnerable, designed to make you feel like you were the only person in the room who mattered. Let me tell you something about a man who shows up at your job uninvited. He's not there to talk. He's there to remind you that he knows where you are. "Walk what back, Landon?" I said. My keys were in my fist, the teeth pressed between my knuckles, not because Vernon taught me that, but because my body had started making decisions my mind hadn't caught up to yet. The restraining order you filed against me, or the hidden debt I found in our guest room drawer. The smile didn't drop. It shifted. The warmth drained from his eyes, the way color drains from a sky before a storm. Not suddenly, but with a certainty you can feel in your chest. "Who told you about that?" His voice dropped half a register. "Was it Tamara? Because she has a history of making things up. Ask anyone." There it was, the name. He knew I'd found her. He knew we'd talked. And his first instinct wasn't to explain or apologize. It was to discredit her. The same word he'd used at Thanksgiving. Unstable. The same dismissal, recycled for a new audience. "She didn't tell me anything," I said. "Your own paperwork did." Watching Landon switch from charm to threat was like watching someone take off a mask, except the mask was better looking than anything underneath it. The counseling story evaporated. The soft voice disappeared. What remained was the man from the kitchen, stripped of the performance, standing in a parking lot with gravel under his polished shoes and nothing left to sell. "You have a history of overreacting," he said, flat, clinical, like he was reading from a brief. "People know that. My lawyer knows that. A judge will know that. A history of overreacting." He said it like a diagnosis, like something that already existed in a file somewhere, documented and verified. But I knew the truth. He was building that file himself, sentence by sentence, conversation by conversation, laying the groundwork for a version of me that existed nowhere except inside his narrative. The same way he'd built a version of Tamara. The same script, the same playbook. Different woman, same 5 words rearranged. I didn't answer. I didn't give him anything to work with. Kezia had taught me that silence was a weapon too, and in that moment I used it the way Vernon taught me to use leverage, by holding still and letting the other person's momentum do the work. Landon stepped closer, close enough that I could see the vein in his temple, close enough that the cologne mixed with the hot asphalt and the exhaust from a delivery truck idling at the curb. "Drop this," he said, quiet, deliberate, a voice meant for a room with no witnesses, because if you don't know what they'll find. How do you respond to a man who tells you the truth will destroy you? When the truth is the only weapon you have left, you don't respond. You let him walk away. You watch him cross the parking lot with his jacket over his arm and his shoulders squared like a man who still believes he's winning. And you sit in your car with your hands shaking on the steering wheel, and you breathe until the copper taste of held-back anger fades enough for you to drive. I sat there for 10 minutes. The car ticked as the engine cooled. My keys left red marks on my palm from gripping them too hard. Then my phone buzzed. Tamara, a text, not a call. 3 lines on a bright screen in a dim car. He just called me. He knows we talked. He said if I testify, he'll make sure I lose everything. Again. I stared at the message. My hands had stopped shaking. Something harder had replaced the trembling. Not fear, not anger, something structural. Something that had been building since the kitchen floor and was now setting like concrete. Landon had made one critical miscalculation. He assumed threatening Tamara would make her retreat, the way it had 6 years ago. But the woman who kept a box of bank statements in her closet for 6 years wasn't the same woman who fled to her sister's house in Philadelphia. She had changed, and so had I. Tamara Hewitt had spent years teaching herself to flinch, years of checking over her shoulder, screening calls from unknown numbers, keeping her bookkeeping client list private so no one from her old life could find her. And in one morning, the morning after Landon's threats arrived, she unlearned every bit of it. She told me all of this later, sitting across from me with a cup of tea she kept forgetting to drink. But what happened on day 16 in her apartment, I'm telling you the way she told me, because it deserves to be heard exactly as she lived it. The texts started before sunrise, 5 of them arriving in a chain that escalated the way Landon always escalated. Slowly at first, then all at once. The first was almost casual. I heard you've been talking to people about things that aren't your business anymore. The second added weight. Remember how that went last time? I kept it civil then. I won't again. The third was the one that proved something I hadn't fully understood until that morning. Landon had been tracking Tamara's life for years after their divorce. He named her biggest bookkeeping client by name. He referenced her new address, the one she'd moved to specifically to get away from him. He mentioned a custody arrangement she'd fought for with a family member's child she was helping raise. There's a specific kind of man who keeps a list of everything he can use against you, not on paper, but in his head, updated quietly, waiting for the day you stop being useful. Landon had been maintaining that list for 6 years. Tamara was never free of him. She was just on pause. The 5th text was the one designed to break her. Nice client list you've built. Would be a shame if someone mentioned the IRS audit from 2021, the one that wasn't really an audit. She read them 3 times. The first time, her hands shook. The second time, she cried. The coffee she'd poured went cold on the counter. The old paper smell of her filing cabinet mixed with the morning air and the ink from documents she hadn't touched in years. The third time she read them, she got up and opened that filing cabinet. Before I tell you what Tamara did next, before I show you the document that ended Landon's entire defense, comment your prediction in 1 sentence. Do you think she folded or fought? A quick note. The next part includes some fictionalized details added to deepen the emotional impact. What matters is the lesson behind it. 6 years of silence. 6 years of rebuilding a life from the foundation up. And Tamara dismantled all of it in 45 minutes with a scanner, a phone, and a fury that had been waiting since 2019. She photographed every one of Landon's texts, timestamps, phone number, full thread. She pulled the remaining documents from her personal files, bank records she hadn't sent to the cafe, email printouts with dates circled in the margins, and something none of us knew existed until that morning. A letter, handwritten, 2 pages, front and back, in Landon's own hand, sent to Tamara during their divorce proceedings in 2019. The letter was creased from years of folding and refolding, the kind of creases that come from a document someone picks up late at night, reads one more time, and puts away because they're not ready to use it yet. Tamara had kept it in the back of her filing cabinet behind her tax records, in an envelope labeled insurance in her own handwriting. She scanned everything, every page, every text, every email. She sent the entire package to Kezia's office email with one line in the subject. He threatened me this morning. Here's everything. Then she texted me. I just sent everything to your lawyer. Every document, every text he sent this morning, and something he wrote me in 2019 that he probably forgot exists. He won't see this coming. I stared at that message for a full minute. This was the woman Landon said would crumble. The woman he described as unstable. The woman he assumed would retreat the way she had 6 years ago, because that's what his playbook predicted. A second text followed. He threatened the wrong person this time. I'm not 23 anymore. Landon had spent years building walls around his secrets, and he'd just handed the blueprints to the one person who knew where every door was hidden. He had tracked her address, her clients, her life, and none of it mattered, because the one thing he should have tracked was the filing cabinet in her apartment and the letter inside it that he'd written with his own hand. Kezia called me an hour after Tamara's package arrived. Her voice was different, not cautious, not strategic. For the first time since I'd hired her, Kezia Farrell sounded excited. The letter, she said, the one he wrote during their divorce. He admits to the account. In his own handwriting, he describes the transfers. He explains why he didn't disclose them. He put it all on paper and mailed it to her because he was arrogant enough to think she would never use it. She paused. We don't just have a case anymore. We have his confession. I hung up and sat in the Dover kitchen with the phone in my lap. And for the first time since the night on the kitchen floor, I felt something I had almost forgotten the shape of. Not hope, certainty. The confession letter changed our case from strong to airtight. Across town, in an office I would never set foot in, Landon's own lawyer told him to settle. And Landon laughed. I didn't learn what happened in that office until months later, from a paralegal who couldn't stop shaking her head about it. Day 17. The attorney laid out the damage, pattern evidence spanning 2 marriages, a written admission in Landon's own hand, fresh threats sent to a witness days before a hearing. He advised Landon to settle immediately. Landon leaned back in his chair and said something the paralegal told me she would never forget. She's a 29-year-old program coordinator who's been married for 3 weeks. I'm a certified financial planner with 15 years of client relationships. Who do you think a judge believes? Here's the thing about men who say, I know how to handle this. They're not talking about the problem. They're talking about the person, and they always underestimate her. He walked out of that office believing he was still the smartest person in the room, the way he'd believed it in every room he'd ever entered. The kitchen, the mediation, the parking lot. The evidence didn't matter. The letter didn't matter. Because Landon believed the performance would always be enough. It wouldn't. The next evening, day 18, Vernon sat across from me at the Dover kitchen table and did something Landon would never think to do. He prepared me with the truth. My father never raised his voice when it mattered most. That was how you knew he was serious. When the room got so quiet, you could hear the clock on the wall above the stove ticking between sentences. He had a cup of black coffee in front of him. I had testimony notes spread across the table and a glass of water he'd placed at my elbow without being asked. The kitchen smelled like dish soap and whatever Lorraine had cooked the night before. Pot roast, I think, though my mother hadn't come downstairs since dinner. When they ask you why you stayed, Vernon said, what do you say? Because I believed him. Good. Short, true. Don't explain it. Let them sit with it. He asked me again. Then he asked it a different way. Then he asked the question a defense attorney would ask, the version designed to make me stumble. But you chose to marry him after your father expressed concerns. Isn't that true? And he taught me how to answer without defending, without explaining, without giving ground. Yes, I chose to believe my husband over my father, and I was wrong. Vernon prepared me for that courtroom, the same way he'd prepared me for everything, not by telling me I was strong enough, but by proving it to me one question at a time. He asked about the kitchen, about the ER, about the mediation, about the financial records. Each time I answered, he listened the way he'd listened to thousands of intake interviews, not for what I said, but for how I said it. When my voice cracked on the word shoved, he pushed the glass of water across the table and waited. You don't need to throw anyone in a courtroom, Cress, he said. Just tell the truth. The truth is heavy enough on its own. My father had spent 30 years watching people lie in rooms designed to catch them. He knew exactly what the truth sounded like. Steady, specific, unhurried. And he spent 2 hours making sure I sounded like that too. By the time we finished, the kitchen was dark except for the light above the stove, and the testimony notes were covered in Vernon's small handwriting, corrections, suggestions, reminders to breathe. As I was packing my notes to leave, Vernon opened the kitchen drawer. He pulled out the logbook, the same cracked leather cover, the same lined pages, the same corrections officer penmanship I'd been seeing since I was old enough to recognize my father's handwriting. He opened it to a page near the middle, dated 3 months before the wedding, April 2025. I wrote this the first time I met him, he said, at that dinner before Easter. Read it tonight, then decide if you still think any of this was an accident. I took the logbook home to my old bedroom. I sat on the edge of the bed with the lamp on and the house silent around me. The page was dated April 12, 2025. Vernon's handwriting filled half the page, small, precise, every word chosen the way a man chooses words when he knows they might matter later. I started reading, and by the second paragraph, I understood that my father hadn't just suspected Landon. He had profiled him. What Vernon had written about Landon made me put the logbook down and sit in the dark for a long time. His handwriting was small and precise, corrections officer penmanship, every letter accountable, and the entry was dated April 12th, 2025, 3 months before the wedding. He had watched Landon across the Easter dinner table and written 4 observations that read less like a father's worry and more like an intake assessment. Subject redirects every conversation to his own accomplishments within 90 seconds. Maintained eye contact with Cressida only when she was agreeing with him. Touched her lower back 3 times to steer her physically during a verbal disagreement about seating. When Vernon asked about his previous marriage, subject changed the topic and did not return to it. Vernon had underlined the last sentence twice. My father had seen what I couldn't, not because I was blind, because I was in love, and love is a blindfold you tie on yourself. I closed the logbook and pressed my palms against the cover. The leather was cracked and soft, body warm from sitting on my lap. The house was silent except for the clock in the hallway and the occasional creak of the floorboards above me where Lorraine was pretending to sleep. Then the tablet on the nightstand lit up. It was Landon's old tablet, the one he'd left at the Wilmington apartment when I moved out. I'd forgotten to return it, and his iCloud was still synced to a family group chat. I hadn't looked at it in weeks, but the screen glowed with a burst of new messages, and before I could stop myself, I was reading. Most of the messages were what I expected. Landon's cousin calling me unstable. His aunt saying she'd always known I was too young for him. His mother, a woman I'd met exactly twice, typing in all capitals that Landon was being railroaded by a vindictive girl who couldn't handle a real marriage. You want to know what's worse than a family that doesn't believe you? A family that believes you and stays quiet anyway, because keeping the peace matters more than keeping you safe. Then a name I didn't recognize posted a single message. Someone called Aunt Gail, listed without a last name in the chat. I'm just saying, same thing happened last time. Ask Cousin Drew what Landon did to his business partner. Then everybody went quiet about that too. The message sat there for 11 minutes. I watched the chat in real time, holding my breath, waiting for someone to respond. No one did. Then the message disappeared, deleted. But I'd already taken the screenshot, and so had someone else apparently, because within the hour, 3 people left the group chat without explanation. The thread went from 22 members to 19, and the remaining messages shifted tone. Less certainty, more silence. The kind of silence that happens when people realize someone just said the thing they'd all agreed never to say. His own family knew, not all of them, but enough of them, and they'd chosen silence every single time. I forwarded the screenshots to Kezia and set the tablet face down on the nightstand. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from something closer to disgust. Landon hadn't just done this to me. He hadn't just done it to Tamara. There was a business partner. There was a Cousin Drew. There was a pattern so old that his own relatives had developed a protocol for not discussing it. I went downstairs at 11 and sat at the kitchen table with Vernon's logbook and my testimony notes spread in front of me. The coffee from that afternoon was still in the pot, cold and bitter, but I reheated it and drank it anyway. The kitchen smelled like paper and ink and the faint ghost of Lorraine's pot roast from dinner. I went through Vernon's practice questions again, whispering the answers to myself in the dark kitchen, trying to make my voice steady on the words that still wanted to crack. Have you ever sat in a house the night before everything changes and tried to memorize the silence, because you know that by tomorrow nothing will sound the same? The phone buzzed at 12:17 a.m. Tamara. I'll be there, she said. No preamble, no small talk. Front row, I've already confirmed with Kezia. Thank you, I said, and meant it in a way I didn't have the vocabulary for. There was a pause. I could hear her breathing on the other end, the careful breath of a woman deciding how much to say. Cressida, there's one more thing I haven't told you. I didn't put it in the documents because I wanted to say it out loud, in front of him, where he can't deny it. My hand tightened on the phone. What is it? You'll hear it tomorrow. Just trust me. It's the thing that ends this. 6 years of silence. One phone call past midnight, and a woman I'd known for 8 days was about to do what Landon's own family never had the courage to do. I hung up and walked to the kitchen window. The yard was black except for the motion light on the garage, which flickered on and off with the wind. I rinsed my coffee cup in the sink and set my alarm for 6. The hearing was at 9. In 3 hours, Tamara would say whatever she'd been carrying since her own marriage ended. Kezia would present the evidence we'd built from 2 broken marriages and 1 handwritten confession, and Landon would walk into that courtroom believing he'd already won. One of us was wrong about how this would end. The morning of the hearing, I drove to Wilmington with Vernon's logbook in my bag and Tamara's promise ringing in my ears. Whatever she'd carried for 6 years, I was about to hear it in a room where Landon couldn't run. Landon wore a navy suit and a wedding band. I noticed the ring before his face, the same band I'd watched him slide off and drop into a kitchen drawer 4 days after the ceremony. He'd said he didn't like metal on his skin. Now it caught the courtroom light every time he adjusted his cuff, polished and deliberate, a prop for the performance ahead. Newcastle County Courthouse smelled like old wood and floor polish and recycled government air. The courtroom was wood-paneled, smaller than I'd expected, with fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly ill. Vernon sat 3 rows behind me, hands folded, wearing the expression he wore when deciding whether someone was telling the truth. Lorraine was not there. Kezia sat beside me at the respondent's table, her legal binder thick with tabbed evidence. Across the aisle, Landon's attorney, tall, charcoal suit, silver cufflinks, stood and began. Let me tell you what it feels like to sit in a courtroom and listen to someone describe a version of your life that never happened, and watch people nod along like it makes perfect sense. Your Honor, the medical records speak for themselves, Landon's attorney said. Mr. Prescott arrived at Christiana Care with a fractured rib and contusions consistent with a physical assault. His wife, of 3 weeks, has offered no explanation except to claim she was defending herself from a man who has never had a single complaint filed against him. He walked the judge through the ER intake, the ambulance call, the initial police statement, the one I'd given, while Landon whispered to the intake nurse in the next room. He made it sound clean and simple. A young woman with a temper married a man she couldn't control, and when the marriage failed in under a month, she lashed out. Ms. Ballard has since enlisted his ex-wife, a woman with her own grievances, to manufacture a pattern that simply does not exist, he said. This is not evidence. This is coordination. I watched Judge Constance Alderman while Landon's lawyer spoke. She was a 20-year family court veteran with reading glasses she never actually wore, just held in her left hand like a pointer. Her eyes moved between the attorney and the submitted documents, and her expression gave nothing away, which was worse than skepticism, because skepticism meant she was questioning the story. How do you compete with a man who lies the way other people breathe, effortlessly, consistently, and without ever breaking eye contact? Then Landon took the stand. Hun unbuttoned his jacket as he sat, a gesture so natural it looked unrehearsed. His voice was steady, warm, concerned. I love my wife, he said, and the word wife landed like something sacred. I don't understand what happened that night, but I've been seeing a counselor, and I want to work through this. I filed the protective order because I was afraid, not angry. I didn't want to punish her. I wanted space to heal. I was perfect. Every word calibrated, every pause timed. He mentioned counseling. He referenced our vows. He said forgiveness twice, spaced far enough apart to sound spontaneous. His cologne drifted from the witness stand, the same cologne he'd worn the night he shoved me into the counter. If I hadn't lived through that kitchen, I would have believed him too. The judge's expression shifted during his testimony, a softening around the eyes, a slight forward lean. She was responding to his composure the way people always responded to Landon, with the assumption that a man who sounds this reasonable must be telling the truth. I looked at Kezia. She wasn't watching Landon. She was watching the judge, and her expression told me she'd seen this before. The exact moment a courtroom starts to believe the wrong person. My palms were slick against the table's edge. The coffee from that morning sat bitter at the back of my throat. Vernon hadn't moved behind me. I could feel his stillness like a hand on my shoulder. Landon finished and returned to his seat without looking at me. He didn't need to. He'd done what he came to do. Judge Alderman set her glasses on the bench and turned to Kezia. Ms. Farrell, does the respondent wish to present additional witnesses? Kezia stood. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look at her notes. Yes, Your Honor. The respondent calls Tamara Hewitt, Mr. Prescott's first wife. The courtroom went still. Not quiet, still. The kind of silence that happens when every person in a room holds their breath at the same time. I watched Landon's face, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw something he couldn't hide. Not anger, not calculation, fear. The courtroom doors opened, and Tamara Hewitt walked in, wearing a gray blazer and an expression I recognized. The face of a woman who had already decided she had nothing left to lose. Landon's fear lasted only a second. Then his mask slid back into place, smooth and practiced, and he folded his hands on the table as if he'd been expecting her all along. I hadn't. Landon's attorney was on his feet before Tamara reached the center aisle. Objection, Your Honor. This witness was not disclosed in the original filing. Judge Alderman didn't even look up from the supplemental documents Kezia had submitted. The evidence was filed within the statutory window, Counselor. Overruled. She turned to Tamara. Ms. Hewitt, please take the stand. Tamara walked past Landon's table, close enough to touch him. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Every step was a sentence she'd been composing for 6 years. Measured, deliberate, aimed. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and sat down with her back straight and her hands folded on the witness stand rail. Kezia stood. Ms. Hewitt, can you state your relationship to the petitioner? I was married to Landon Prescott for 6 years, Tamara said. Her voice was clear, unhurried, pitched for the back of the room. During that time, I was not allowed to make a purchase over $50 without his written approval. He called it budgeting. I called it control. Eventually. Watching. Tamara testify was like watching someone dismantle a building from the inside, pulling out one load-bearing lie at a time until there was nothing left holding the walls up. She described the system, not in generalizations, not in emotions, in specifics, dates, account numbers, dollar amounts that matched what Kezia had found in my case down to the routing structure. Landon had opened accounts at the same bank, used the same transfer method, told the same story about emergency savings that didn't exist. He hadn't even changed the playbook. He'd simply found a new person to use it on. He opened an account at the same institution, Tamara said, used the same routing structure, and told me the same thing he told your client, that it was for emergencies. There were no emergencies. There was only Landon moving money where I couldn't see it. The court reporter's keys scratched steadily in the silence. The gallery, a dozen people, maybe fewer, sat motionless. Vernon was still behind me, and I could feel him listening, the way he listened to everything, cataloging each fact against what he already knew. There's a sound a courtroom makes when the truth finally arrives. It's not a gasp or a murmur. It's a settling, like everyone in the room exhaling at the same time, because the thing they suspected has finally been said out loud. Kezia guided Tamara through the financial timeline. Their joint account that wasn't joint, the credit cards opened in Tamara's name that Tamara never applied for, the debt that appeared like weather, sudden and unexplained. Tamara answered every question the same way: date, fact, consequence. No adjectives, no tears, just the architecture of a marriage built on financial manipulation, laid out brick by brick. And when you confronted him about the hidden accounts, Kezia said, what was his response? Tamara's hands tightened on the rail. It was the first movement she'd made that wasn't controlled. He didn't explain, she said. He shoved me into a doorframe and told me I was imagining things. That was November 2018. Same bank, same account structure, same lie, same violence. 6 years apart, 2 different women, and Landon hadn't even bothered to change the script. I looked at him. His hands were flat on the table, perfectly still, but his jaw was working, the small, rhythmic clench I'd seen in the kitchen right before everything broke. His attorney had stopped writing. The cologne Landon wore drifted through the recycled courtroom air, and for a moment I was back in that kitchen, smelling the same scent while my shoulder hit the counter edge. Judge Alderman had removed her glasses entirely. She was watching Tamara with an expression I hadn't seen during Landon's testimony. Not just attention, but recognition. The look of a woman who had spent 20 years on the family court bench and knew exactly what she was hearing. Tamara paused. She looked down at her hands on the rail, then lifted her head and did something she hadn't done since walking into the courtroom. She looked directly at Landon. I didn't look away. He couldn't. Not with the judge watching, not with the court reporter recording every twitch. But the color had drained from his face in a way that no navy suit and no polished wedding band could disguise. "But that's not why I'm here today," Tamara said. Her voice dropped, not in volume, but in register. Lower, steadier, the voice of someone about to say the thing they've rehearsed 10,000 times in the dark. "I'm here because of what happened after the shove. The thing I never reported. The thing I've carried for 6 years because I thought no one would believe me." Judge Alderman leaned forward. "Continue, Ms. Hewitt." Tamara took a breath. And across the aisle, Landon Prescott sat perfectly still, because for the first time in his life, he had no idea what was coming next. Tamara's voice didn't shake, and that was the part that undid him. She sat on that witness stand with her hands folded and her back straight, and when Judge Alderman said, "Continue," Tamara took one breath and delivered the thing she'd been carrying since November 2018. "After he pushed me into the doorframe," she said, "I was on the floor. My shoulder was bleeding where it caught the hinge, and Landon knelt down next to me, not to help me up, not to check if I was hurt. He knelt down and he said 5 words. She paused. The courtroom was so quiet, I could hear the court reporter's fingers hovering above the keys, waiting. He said, "Don't turn this into a thing." The air left my lungs. I gripped the edge of the table with both hands and felt the wood grain press into my fingertips because I needed something solid to hold on to. The same words, the exact same 5 words he'd whispered to me in the kitchen while I was still trying to understand what had just happened. He'd knelt beside me too. He'd used the same tone, quiet, almost gentle, as if the violence had been a shared accident and the only real danger was making it matter. 5 words, 2 women, 6 years apart, and he hadn't changed a single syllable because it had always worked before. Tamara wasn't finished. Kezia stepped forward and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into Evidence Exhibits D through K, 6 years of financial records from Ms. Hewitt's marriage, showing the identical account structure and concealment pattern documented in the respondent's filing." Judge Alderman accepted them without objection. Landon's attorney didn't stand. He sat at the petitioner's table with his pen flat on his legal pad, staring at the documents being passed to the bench like a man watching a building he'd constructed begin to fold inward. Tamara walked the courtroom through the records, the joint account that was never joint, the credit applications filed in her name without her knowledge, the debt that materialized like weather. She matched each element to what Kezia had uncovered in my case. Same institution, same routing method, same story about emergencies that never existed. The pattern wasn't similar, it was identical. I want you to understand what it means when an attorney walks away from a client in the middle of a hearing. It means the lawyer looked at the evidence, looked at his client, and decided his own reputation was worth more than the fee. Landon's attorney requested an emergency recess. Judge Alderman granted 15 minutes. I watched Landon and his lawyer step into the hallway, and through the frosted glass panel beside the courtroom door, I could see them standing 3 feet apart, the attorney's gestures sharp, Landon's posture rigid. When the door opened again, only the attorney walked to the bench. Your Honor, I must respectfully withdraw my representation of Mr. Prescott. His voice was steady but thin, like a wire pulled taut. A conflict of interest has come to my attention that prevents me from continuing in good conscience. Judge Alderman removed her glasses and studied him for a long moment. Noted, the court accepts your withdrawal. She turned to the petitioner's table, where Landon now sat alone, his briefcase closed, his hands flat on the surface. Mr. Prescott, you have the right to seek new counsel or to proceed pro se. How do you wish to proceed? Landon, without his lawyer, was like a house with the scaffolding pulled away. Everyone in that courtroom could finally see the cracks that had been there all along. The tight jaw, the restless fingers, the way his eyes moved between the judge and the gallery, as if calculating which audience still believed him. I looked at Tamara. She was still on the witness stand, her hands resting on the rail, watching Landon with an expression I could only describe as patience. Not triumph, not satisfaction. The steady, weathered patience of a woman who had waited 6 years for a room to finally see what she'd seen alone. Kezia sat beside me with her binder open, a yellow tab marking the next section of evidence. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The case was no longer something we were building. It was something Landon was standing inside while it came down around him. Vernon was behind me in the gallery. I didn't turn around, but I heard him exhale, a slow, measured breath, the same sound he used to make at the prison when a man in intake said the one thing that sealed everything. Landon straightened his tie. He looked at Judge Alderman, and when he spoke, his voice carried the last remnants of the composure that had served him his entire adult life. I'll represent myself, Your Honor. I have nothing to hide. From the gallery, Vernon exhaled again, shorter this time, almost a sound. The sound a man makes when he's heard that exact sentence 100 times before from 100 men who all had something to hide. Judge Alderman nodded. Very well. Mr. Prescott, you may cross-examine the witness. Landon stood. He buttoned his jacket. He turned toward Tamara on the witness stand, and for the first time in this hearing, there was no attorney between them, no filter, no strategy, no one to stop him from being exactly who he was. Landon lasted 11 minutes representing himself, and every one of them made it worse. Without his attorney's filter, the courtroom heard exactly what I'd heard in the kitchen: the dismissals, the redirections, the quiet fury dressed up as reason. He badgered Tamara about dates she'd already confirmed. He contradicted his own filings. He told Judge Alderman that 2 women with matching stories proved coordination, not abuse, and the judge's expression shifted from neutral to something I can only describe as resolved. She called a brief recess. When we reconvened, she read from a written ruling she'd prepared during the break, 3 pages, handwritten, in a script as precise as Vernon's. The petitioner's request for a protective order against the respondent is denied, Judge Alderman said. The court finds sufficient evidence of a pattern of coercive control and financial abuse spanning 2 marriages. A protective order is hereby granted in favor of the respondent, Ms. Ballard. Mr. Prescott is ordered to maintain a distance of 500 feet from Ms. Ballard, her residence, and her place of employment, effective immediately. There's a moment after you win something you are afraid to lose where your body doesn't know what to do, so it does everything at once. Your chest tightens and releases, your hands go numb, your eyes burn, and you sit perfectly still and wait for it to pass. I didn't cry. I didn't move. Vernon's hand found mine from the row behind me, reaching over the gallery rail, and he squeezed once, the same way he did when I was 7 and learning to ride without training wheels. One squeeze. You did it. Tamara stepped down from the witness stand. She walked past Landon's table, his table, alone now, no briefcase, no attorney, no audience, and she didn't look at him. She'd said what she came to say. 6 years of silence, delivered in under 40 minutes, and every word of it on the record. Landon stood. He buttoned his jacket with fingers that moved too deliberately, the way a man moves when he's performing control he no longer has. He walked out of the courtroom without looking at anyone. No expression, no reaction. The doors swung shut behind him, and the sound echoed in the wood-paneled room like a period at the end of a sentence. Kezia closed her binder. The yellow tabs caught the fluorescent light. She leaned toward me and said, quietly, "It's done." But it wasn't, not yet. When does a private story become a public one? The moment a reporter writes it down, or the moment you stop being ashamed of it? Outside the courthouse, the July heat hit my face like a wall. A woman with a press badge from the Wilmington News Journal stopped Kezia on the steps. I heard the words public record and pattern of abuse and 2 marriages and realized this wasn't just my story anymore. It was about to belong to everyone who read a headline over breakfast and formed an opinion about a woman they'd never met. Kezia handled her with 3 sentences and a card. Vernon walked me to his truck in the parking lot, the same truck he'd driven me to school in, with its cracked leather seats and the coffee thermos wedged between the console and the emergency brake. He handed me a bottle of water and started the engine and didn't say anything, because Vernon never spoke first after something heavy. He waited for you to find the words, and if you couldn't, the silence was enough. I drank the water and tasted salt. I hadn't realized I was crying until the bottle was half empty and the label was wet. If you've ever wondered what it sounds like when a man's entire world starts closing in from directions he never saw coming, it sounds like a phone call from his own company's HR department on the worst day of his life. My phone rang. Unknown number, Wilmington area code. I almost didn't answer, but something Vernon had taught me years ago, always pick up the call you're not expecting, because the expected ones rarely matter, made me swipe the screen. Ms. Ballard, I'm calling from Cornerstone Wealth Advisors. The woman's voice was measured, corporate, carefully neutral. We're conducting an internal review of accounts managed by Landon Prescott. I can't share details of our investigation, but I need to ask, are the financial records referenced in today's court filing available for our compliance team to review? I sat in my father's truck and listened to a stranger from Landon's own company tell me, in the most careful corporate language possible, that this wasn't his first time. The records, the accounts, the pattern Kezia had documented. Cornerstone had found the same threads pulling from the inside. Yes, I said. Talk to my attorney, Kezia Farrell. The woman paused before hanging up. Her voice dropped half a register, slipping below the corporate script into something human. Ms. Ballard, I probably shouldn't say this, but you're not the only person who's called us about him this month. And the other call didn't come from a spouse. She hung up before I could ask what she meant. I stared at the phone in my hand. Vernon looked at me from the driver's seat, reading my face the way he read everything, patiently, completely, without rushing to a conclusion. What was that? He asked. His company, I said. Someone else reported him, someone inside. Vernon nodded once, put the truck in reverse, and pulled out of the parking lot. He didn't say another word until we were on Route 1 heading south toward Dover, and even then, all he said was, "Good." How long does it take for a man's entire life to come apart? The career, the reputation, the version of himself he spent 15 years constructing. In Landon's case, it took 3 weeks. The person inside Cornerstone who had reported him wasn't a spouse or an ex-girlfriend. It was a junior analyst who'd noticed routing discrepancies in client accounts and filed a compliance report 6 months before I ever walked into that kitchen. Tamara called me in early August from Kezia's office. Her voice was different now, not the careful, measured tone of a woman testifying under oath, but something looser, almost lighter, like a knot finally untied. "Cornerstone fired him yesterday," she said. "Not suspended, terminated. The compliance investigation found enough to refer the case to the State Financial Board. His license is under review." She told me what Kezia had learned through the court filings that were now public record. The internal investigation had uncovered years of client account mismanagement, fees diverted, transfers authorized without signatures, a pattern of financial manipulation that mirrored what he'd done to both of us but scaled to a business. The court case had accelerated the corporate review. The analyst who'd filed the original compliance report had been quietly promoted. People ask me if it felt good when he lost everything. The honest answer is that it felt necessary, which is a different thing entirely. Satisfaction implies you wanted it. Necessity implies it was always coming, and you just happened to be the reason it arrived when it did. I waited for some surge of triumph after Tamara hung up. It didn't come. What arrived instead was something quieter, the feeling of a door finally closing on a room I never should have entered. Relief, yes, but underneath it, exhaustion so deep it felt structural, like the tiredness had settled into my bones and would take months to leave. 6 years ago, nobody believed me, Tamara had said before we hung up. Today, everyone can see. I set the phone down on my nightstand in the Dover bedroom and stared at the ceiling for a long time. The local newspaper ran the hearing story the following week. It wasn't front page. A domestic case in family court doesn't make front page in Wilmington, but it was thorough. The reporter had pulled the public filings, quoted the judge's ruling, and included a line about Cornerstone's termination that turned a personal story into a professional one. The article used the phrase, "pattern of coercive control across 2 marriages," and cited the financial evidence Kezia had entered into the record. The newspaper article sat on my mother's kitchen table like a grenade with the pin already pulled. I watched Lorraine read it the way you watch someone finally open a letter they've been avoiding for weeks, slowly, with both hands flat on the table, her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead because she kept forgetting to put them on. She read it twice. She folded the paper carefully along its original creases. Then she sat there for a long time, her fingers smudged with newsprint ink, staring at the window above the sink where the late summer light was turning the kitchen gold. I was in the doorway. I hadn't planned to be there. I'd come down for coffee and found her sitting with the paper and couldn't make myself leave. "I read the article," Lorraine said, without looking up. "All of it. And I sat here for 2 hours trying to figure out what to say to you that doesn't sound like an excuse." "Then don't make one," I said. My mother had never apologized to me for anything in 29 years. Not because she was never wrong, but because she believed admitting it would make her less of a mother, when the opposite had always been true. Lorraine looked at me. Her eyes were red, but her voice was steady, the kind of steady that costs everything to maintain. "I should have stood with you," she said, "from the first night. I should have stood with you, and I didn't, and I will carry that. The kitchen smelled like something she'd baked earlier. Banana bread, maybe, cooling on the counter, and coffee reheated too many times, and newsprint, and the Dover evening coming through the screen door. I stood in the doorway and felt something crack inside me that wasn't pain. It was the shell I'd built around the part of me that still needed my mother to believe me. Vernon appeared behind me. He leaned against the doorframe with his hand resting on the wood, his coffee mug in the other hand, and he looked at Lorraine the way he looked at everything that mattered, patiently, without rushing to a conclusion. "She's here now, Cress," he said quietly. "That's what matters." It wasn't enough, but it was a start, and after everything, I'd learned that starts were worth more than I used to think. Lorraine wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and said one more thing before she left the kitchen. "There's something else. Landon called here 2 days ago. Your father answered." She paused. "I don't know what Vernon said to him, but Landon hasn't called back." I looked at Vernon. He was staring at his coffee like it owed him something. He took a sip, set the mug down with a quiet clink, and said nothing. Whatever my father had said to Landon Prescott on that phone call, it was the last conversation the two men ever had. I never did find out what Vernon said to Landon on the phone, not that night, not the next morning. He drank his coffee and said nothing, and I let it sit, because some things between fathers and the men who hurt their daughters don't need to be repeated at the kitchen table. The annulment papers were 11 pages long. Undoing Landon Prescott took less time than marrying him had. Kezia had them spread across her desk when I arrived at her Wilmington office in mid-August, fanned out in order, each page flagged with a yellow tab where my signature was needed. The afternoon light came through the blinds in bars across the documents, and the office smelled like toner and legal paper and the coffee she'd poured me from the firm's break room without asking. "His new counsel called this morning," Kezia said, leaning back in her chair. "They're not contesting. Landon's exact words, apparently, were just make it go away." She paused to let that land. "Which tells you everything about how he sees this marriage and how he saw you. Just make it go away. 3 years of dating, a wedding at Bellevue State Park, 3 weeks of marriage, and one night in a kitchen that changed everything. And to Landon, the entire thing was an inconvenience to be erased. Not a relationship that hurt a real person, a problem with paperwork. Fraud," Kezia said, tapping the petition. "That's the legal designation. He concealed material facts that would have affected your decision to marry. The prior history, the hidden accounts, the documented pattern. In Delaware, that's textbook grounds for annulment. There's a word for what Landon did to me, and it's not marriage, it's fraud. The state of Delaware agreed, and that's a kind of justice that doesn't require anyone's forgiveness, not his, not mine, not the version of myself who stood in that church believing every word. I thought about the woman who said yes in June. She deserved better than 11 pages on an attorney's desk. But this, the paperwork, the legal language, the fraud designation, was better than pretending the marriage had been real, because it hadn't been, not for him. For me, it had been real, and that was the part that still hurt, buried under all the relief like a stone at the bottom of a cleared river. Kezia walked me through each page. The grounds, the financial disclosures, the protective order reference, the timeline of documented abuse spanning 2 marriages. Each section read like an autopsy of something that had been dead before it started. When does a marriage end? When you sign the papers, or when you stop believing the version of yourself that said yes in the first place? I picked up the pen. It was heavier than I expected, or maybe I was just paying attention to the weight of it for the first time. Page 1, signature. Page 2, initials. Page 3. Somewhere around page 5, I thought about Vernon and the phone call. I'd asked him again that morning, standing in the Dover kitchen while he laced his boots for work. He'd looked at me for a long time, the way he looks when he's deciding how much truth a person needs versus how much they want, and then he said it. I told him if he ever contacted my daughter again, I'd make sure every client he ever had knew exactly who managed their money. One sentence. 30 years of corrections work in every word. Not a threat of violence. Vernon had never been that kind of man. A threat of exposure. The one thing Landon feared more than a courtroom, more than a judge, more than two ex-wives comparing notes. The thing that would follow him into every professional room he ever entered. Landon hadn't called back. I signed my name 11 times that afternoon. Each one felt less like an ending and more like a correction, the kind you make in a ledger when someone else has been writing in your column without permission. Page 9, page 10, page 11. I set the pen down and looked at my hands. They were resting flat on the last page, perfectly still. The last time I'd signed something with Landon's name on it, I was wearing white and my hands trembled with what I thought was happiness. Now they were steady, and that steadiness was worth more than anything I'd lost. My hands aren't shaking, I said. Kezia looked at me across the desk. She smiled. The first real smile I'd seen from her since we met in the brew, ha-ha, weeks ago. No, she said, they're not. I stood to leave. Kezia's chair creaked as she leaned forward. One more thing. Tamara asked me to give you this. She slid an envelope across the desk. No stamp, no return address. I opened it standing in the doorway of the office, with the afternoon light falling across the floor and the quiet hum of the building settling around me. Inside was a photograph. Tamara and Landon on their wedding day, 2013. She was younger, her hair longer, her smile wide and trusting. Landon stood beside her in a navy suit, the same suit or one so similar it didn't matter, with the same smile he'd worn at our wedding, the same practiced warmth, the same performance. On the back, in Tamara's neat handwriting, same smile, same suit, same lie. You survived it. So did I. Dinner Friday. I slid the photo back into the envelope and held it against my chest. For the first time in months, I felt something that wasn't relief or exhaustion or vindication. It was lighter than all of those. It took me a moment to recognize it. It was the beginning of laughing again. That Friday dinner with Tamara became every Friday. We met at restaurants neither of us had been to with Landon, new places, uncharged with memory. And over the weeks, the conversation shifted from what he'd done to who we were becoming without him. But before any of that, there was Vernon, standing in my new apartment, checking the locks. My father had never seen the place. It was a one-bedroom in Wilmington, small and clean, with hardwood floors that creaked in the hallway and windows that faced a parking lot and a row of Bradford pears. The first thing Vernon did when he walked in was test every window latch, then the deadbolt, then the chain. His boots sounded heavy on the floors, a new apartment silence that hadn't accumulated the sounds of a life yet. I sat at my kitchen table. I'd arranged it without thinking. Salt and pepper in the center, napkin holder to the left. The same way Lorraine had arranged every table in the Dover house for 30 years. Vernon noticed. He didn't say anything about it, but his eyes moved across the setup, and something shifted in his expression, a softness I rarely saw. He smelled like Dover air and motor oil from the truck, and his jacket carried the cold of an early September evening. I poured him coffee from my own kitchen, the first cup I'd made for someone in a space that was entirely mine, and set it in front of him. I taught you how to throw a punch when you were 12, Vernon said, wrapping his hands around the mug. How to block, how to get out of a hold. You remember why. So I'd never be afraid. No. He looked at me. so you'd never have to use it. That was the whole point, and I'm sorry it didn't work. My father spent 30 years reading people through cell doors and intake forms, and the one time it mattered most, the man walked through our front door in a suit and a smile, and none of us caught it fast enough, not even the man whose entire career was built on catching exactly that. If your father ever apologizes to you, not for something small, but for something that kept him up at night, accept it, even if it arrives late, because men like Vernon only say sorry when they mean it more than anything else they've ever said. You don't owe me an apology, I told him. I know, he said, but you deserve one anyway. Before he left, Vernon reached into his jacket and set something on the table. The logbook, the same cracked leather cover, the same lined pages filled with his small, precise handwriting. He placed it beside the salt shaker like it weighed nothing, but I knew better. 30 years of observations, patterns, instincts, his entire career distilled into a leather cover and the discipline to write things down. Keep it, he said from the doorway, pulling on his jacket. Read it when you're ready. There's a lot in there about recognizing people before they show you who they are. Might have saved us both some trouble if I'd given it to you sooner. He left. I sat at this table with the logbook and my coffee and the quiet of an apartment that was finally entirely mine. 3 weeks later, the annulment was final. Kezia called me into her office to sign the last set of documents. 2 pages this time, not 11. The court had ordered restitution. Landon was required to return the misappropriated wedding funds and the gift cards. His compliance was being monitored by the court, and his financial license review was still pending with the state board. It's done, Kezia said. What do you do with a story that almost destroyed you? Do you lock it away, or do you hand it to someone who needs to hear it before their own story starts? The answer arrived in my mailbox the same week as the certified court documents. Underneath the legal envelope with its official stamps was a letter with a purple logo I didn't recognize. A domestic violence support organization in Newcastle County. They'd read the newspaper article from the summer. They were holding their annual awareness event in November. They wanted me to speak. I stood in the hallway, holding that envelope, and thought about every woman sitting in a kitchen right now, hearing the words that Landon had used on both of us. The same 5 words, spoken in the same quiet tone, designed to make violence feel like nothing. Maybe my story could be the reason one of them decided it was something. I called Tamara that night. I read her the invitation, sitting at my kitchen table with Vernon's logbook open beside me, and an October apple he'd brought from Dover, sitting half-eaten on a napkin. Tamara was quiet for a long time. I could hear her breathing, steady, the way it had been on the witness stand, the way it was now whenever she'd made up her mind. Say yes, she said, and tell them there are 2 of us. I held the phone against my chest and looked at the logbook. It was open to the first page, dated 2003, the year Vernon started at the prison. His handwriting filled the top margin in letters so small I had to lean forward to read them. Trust your instincts. Everyone lies. The paperwork never does. I picked up the phone and dialed the number on the purple envelope. It rang twice. A woman answered, and I said yes. We spoke at the event in November, Tamara first, then me. A room full of strangers who became witnesses, and when I walked off that stage, my hands were steady and my voice was clear, and I knew the story wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to anyone who needed it. But this part, the last part, is mine. The box arrived on a Tuesday. A KitchenAid stand mixer, the same model, the same color. I ordered it with money from my own checking account. No joint card, no shared budget, no permission asked or needed. It sat on my counter in its box for an hour before I unpacked it, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to remember the moment. the weight of it coming out of the cardboard, the solid thud as I set it on the counter, my counter, in my kitchen, in an apartment with my name on the lease. The name change had come through on a Thursday in September. Ballard, my father's name, my mother's name, the name I was born with. Prescott lasted 23 days on my driver's license. Ballard will last the rest of my life. Tamara came over that afternoon to help me set up the kitchen. She carried a bag of groceries and a bottle of wine and an expression I'd come to recognize over the past 4 months of Friday dinners, the look of a woman who had stopped bracing for impact every time she walked through a door. She lifted the mixer onto the counter and ran her hand across the top. "Same one?" she asked. "Same one. Except this time, nobody's going to tell me I spent too much." "How much was it?" "None of your business." We laughed. The kind that starts in the chest and doesn't stop for a while. The kind that fills a kitchen the way steam fills a kitchen. Warm, shapeless, impossible to contain. If you're listening to this and you recognize something, the controlled finances, the quiet threats, the 5-word phrase that makes you shrink, then I need you to know the door is yours. You are allowed to walk through it. You don't need anyone's permission, and you don't need to explain. Tamara and I cooked that afternoon. Nothing complicated. Pasta with garlic and butter and whatever vegetables were in the bag she'd brought. We oversalted the sauce and underdrained the noodles and opened the wine before the water boiled. The kitchen smelled like garlic and steam, and the November chill leaking through the window I'd cracked because the stove ran hot. "You know what I keep thinking," Tamara said, leaning against the counter with her glass. "If he hadn't fought you over a mixer, none of this would have happened. He lost everything because he couldn't let you have a $350 appliance." I shook my head. "He lost everything because he couldn't let me have anything." Tamara and I stood in my kitchen that afternoon and ate a meal that nobody had approved, budgeted, or permitted. It was oversalted and imperfect, and the best thing I'd ever tasted, not because of the food, but because of what it meant. She left around 6. I washed the dishes by hand. I didn't have a dishwasher yet, and I didn't mind. The water was warm, and the apartment was quiet, and the quiet didn't feel like a held breath anymore. It felt like rest. I sat at my kitchen table afterward. Vernon's logbook sat beside the mixer, its cracked leather cover soft under my fingertips. I opened it one more time, not to the entry about Landon, not to the first page with its 2003 inscription. I opened it to a page near the back that I'd found the week before, dated years ago, written in Vernon's small handwriting with no context, no case number, just a single line. "The ones who survive aren't the ones who fight the hardest. They're the ones who know when to move." My father's logbook sat on my kitchen table like a compass that had finally stopped spinning, pointing true north the way it always had, even when I was too lost to read it. My father taught me how to block a punch when I was 12 years old. He stood behind me in the Dover backyard and moved my arms into position and told me to keep my weight on the balls of my feet so I could shift in any direction. I spent 17 years thinking the lesson was about fighting. It wasn't. The lesson was this: you never have to stand still and take it. Not from anyone, not ever. Landon's first punch didn't land. Not because I was stronger than him. I wasn't. Not because I saw it coming. I didn't. It didn't land because I'd spent my whole life being taught that I was allowed to move, that I was allowed to leave, that the door was always mine to walk through, and no one, not a husband, not a fear, not a 5-word sentence whispered on a kitchen floor, could lock it from the outside. I closed the logbook. I set it next to the mixer, the old and the new, the lesson and the proof. I looked around my kitchen, my name on the lease, my money in the bank, my story to tell. The first punch never landed, and I was still standing. I spent 3 weeks married to a man I thought I knew, and months unraveling the life he built on lies. My mistake wasn't trusting him. My mistake was ignoring the quiet voice inside me that said something was wrong, because I wanted the love to be real more than I wanted the truth. Don't make my mistake. Listen to that voice. It knows before you do. Some people hear a story like mine and call it a revenge story, a woman who fought back and won. But that's not what this was. This was a survival story that looked like a revenge story because I refused to stay silent. The real lesson is simpler than revenge. You are allowed to leave. You are allowed to speak. You are allowed to stand in a courtroom or a kitchen or a conversation and say what happened to you out loud, even when every part of you is shaking. I believe God put the right people in my path exactly when I needed them. My father, my attorney, a woman I'd never met who became the friend I didn't know I was missing. That wasn't luck, that was grace. If this story reminded you of someone you know or someone you are, please share it. Sometimes the thing that changes everything isn't courage. It's hearing that somebody else survived it first. Drop a comment and tell me what stayed with you. I read every single one. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. As always, some details have been fictionalized for storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to real individuals is coincidental. The message, that's the part that's real.